beginning of class, I like to display a warm-up activity to just like fill the silence, get you to open your notes. These aren't going to be for points specifically, although occasionally I may ask you to submit one for extra credit, something like that. Just intro to how this class is going to work. Has everybody found where the slides are? I realize we didn't go over that one. Cool. So there's a Google folder linked with slides for this class. There's also a folder linked with the outlines for all of our chapters. So you should basically consider those a study guide. It's what we're going to be expecting that you know when we get to the exam. That's kind of particularly important for chapter 2, where we're going to be skipping a lot of material because you've all had a biology class before, and we're hoping you know some basics about a cell, basically. That's why this class has to be read. It's 11:45. Another matter of class business before we get started. I did get in contact with the bookstore. So those of you who are waiting for updates from the bookstore, the situation is they tell me that there is a global paper shortage, which I had not heard of. I don't know why they would lie. So they say that the textbook publisher will not have copies of your book until the 21st. And I think that means that you probably shouldn't expect to see them until, you know, very end of September, possibly into October, which is not good because we have homework before then and we have an exam on October 4th. So what we're going to do, I'm going to try to find a copy of the textbook from a house or from an old student and put it on course reserve at the library. Also going to try to get some of those upcoming chapters scanned in. If you can find a textbook somewhere else, you should just cancel your order and get it from another source. If you do end up wanting to wait, you can't find it somewhere else, what you should do for the homework is sign up for the Mastering A&P using that trial version. It gives you 2 weeks of access, so you'll have access to the homework. The final thing is, what I do have is an loose leaf version of the previous edition of the textbook. Does anyone have access to a scanner? Any of those waiting on a textbook? Okay. I'm trying to hunt down a scanner that works because the one I tried this morning doesn't. I'll try to scan in these, and if I'm able to do that, I'll email them to you when I get that working. Sorry, it's bad news, but it is what it is. Any other questions as we get started? Class business. Cool. All right. So, final note about the PowerPoints and what they're going to look like. You will see in some places, I know people like to print out their slides and take notes on them. Feel free to do that. What you will notice is that sometimes there will be gaps in the sentences, or there will be a blank line in red. The way these are set up is basically as guided notes, because I know this class is super fast paced. Not everybody writes so fast. I know I don't. So that's to sort of keep your attention. You'll have to put in some key terms. So do pay attention for that. Don't just assume absolutely everything is in the slides you're provided with. But when I present my version of the slides, that blank text will be highlighted in red, so it should pop out. So keep an eye out for that. So warm up. Anybody want to tell me what are some places you think there's water in the body? What we're starting with, right, is a schematic of the body, and we're going to be talking about body water, compartments. If anybody looks ahead, you may know the answer from the textbook, but you're smart kids, right? Like, you can think about your body. Where's there some water?
I'm going to say basically the whole body because cells have water.
Exactly. Yeah. There's going to be a lot of body water. There's going to be water in your cells, right? The cytoplasm has tons of water in it. There's going to be water between your cells. There's water in your blood, right? Bloodstream. That's, you know, obvious. I don't know if any of you donated blood this morning, right? But you saw that liquid coming out in the tubes. And there's water when you drink water, right? Like, it goes through your gastrointestinal tract. There's water all over. We're going to be thinking about water a lot in this course. We're going to be thinking about how different molecules interact with water. We're going to be thinking about how different solutes move between basically different compartments of water. So moving from the outside of the cell to the inside of the cell. And then when we get into A&P2, we'll be thinking a lot about water itself moving through the kidneys, blood getting filtered, things like that. So we're starting out by just kind of getting a general sense of the body systems and how we can categorize this water. So lecture objectives, these are basically what you'll see as well in those outlines. But what we're hoping to learn today is where the water is. We're going to be thinking about homeostasis. So we're going to think about basically what is controlled in the body. What are we trying to keep kind of consistent? We're going to be thinking about feedback and types of feedback and how they relate to this concept of homeostasis. So, as an anatomist, this picture in your textbook of the body gives me the heebie-jeebies, right? Like, does not look like a human. But what it is guiding you to think of here is, in a very simplified version, how we can think about the body, what kinds of things we should be paying attention to. And it's specifically helpful for thinking about how the body holds water, what are the different compartments that we break up water into. So it's simplified to show relationships, the wrong shape, just to make it easier to see, to draw. And it's missing some parts. You know, you won't see specific muscles named on here. You don't see globules of fat on here. We really have it simplified to, we got some cells, we got some very specific organs, we got a little circle for the bloodstream, we have our gastrointestinal tract. So we're trying to visualize some basic relationships. And we can see also that there are arrows here showing movement, right? So we can see here, we got our little heart sending blood around, right? So we got arrows for those blood cells. You can see that we have air moving in and out. We can see that air, right, is actually able to transport gases all the way into our bloodstream. We can see nutrients going through here. We can see filtration of the bloodstream down here. Okay. So this is just very simplified, and we'll be going through each of these systems, and we'll be spending basically weeks on each of these systems. So don't panic about learning exactly all the relationships that are demonstrated here right now. Right now, we're just focusing on what is here, the general components, and we'll be thinking about the body water. One of the things we do want to pay attention to right now is the difference between external and internal environments. So an external and internal environment, when we're talking about this body plan, going to be two sections separated by a continuous barrier, an epithelial membrane. Epithelium is basically like skin, but there are other places you see epithelial cells in the body. We'll see epithelium basically anywhere where we have these pink flat cells, right? Or maybe they're beige, maybe they're orange, I don't know what color they are. This is that epithelial lining. So you'll see that we have an epithelial lining here in the lungs. We actually have epithelium lining our blood vessels, have epithelium lining our gastrointestinal tract and in our kidneys. So this is a lining separating outside from inside, separating our external environment from our internal environment. So we're thinking about the external. Usually I have an iPad, but today it won't charge. So let's do some drawing here with this pen. Okay. So our external environment, right? Part that's probably obvious to us immediately, right, is the outside of the body, the skin. But I don't know if you've ever thought about, you know, after eating a burrito, right? Are you now some certain percentage burrito, right? If you eat a really big one, right? The answer, according to physiology, is basically no, right? That burrito moving through your gastrointestinal tract until you absorb those nutrients doesn't really count as part of your internal environment, right? So other things that we're going to consider external to the body are going to include that gastrointestinal tract, right? So we see a tube. So this is basically your mouth. And then anus, rectum. We're going to see our lungs. Also, when you breathe in air, right, you hold it in your lungs, but it's not part of your body until gases get absorbed across that lining. So another place we'll consider external to the body is the air in the lungs. So your stomach would be somewhere here, right? So food in the stomach, still considered external. Oh, it's supposed to be a star. Urine in the bladder, right? So through the kidney system here, right? We're going to consider that external as well. So all of this outside those lines I drew, right? So here, here, everything out here, right? All of that is external. Everything in the rest of this is internal. Questions about external versus internal thus far? Okay, cool. Okay. So the internal environment is going to be the immediate environment for most of your cells. Right? Most of your cells are not directly touching the external environment. It's really just that epithelial lining. So your skin cells, the lining of your lungs, just those cells on the outside, the very outside lining, are touching the external environment. Everything else is touching fluid somewhere in the body. So our blood cells, right, our red blood cells, for example, those are cells floating around in your cardiovascular system. They're touching fluid in your bloodstream, right? That fluid in your bloodstream, part of the internal environment of the water, right? Or sorry, of the body. Okay? So your muscle cells, for example, in your arm, right? They're touching maybe some interstitial fluid. Maybe they're cuddling up to some blood vessels. They're touching other parts of the internal portion of the body. So the two main things we think about when we're thinking about that fluid that's surrounding other cells, I think about, press the button I didn't expect. So we're thinking about fluid surrounding the tissues. So interstitial fluid. So this inter part, right, basically means between. Anytime you see this stitial, I don't know what the root word there is, but it's basically referring to tissues and cells. Okay, so interstitial is basically between our tissues. It's around the cells. And then we think about fluid around blood cells as its own separate thing. So the technical term for the fluid around your blood cells is plasma. So both of these are considered part of your internal environment, but they're regulated in different ways. And when we get to the cardiovascular system and blood vessels, we'll be talking a lot about how things move between the blood and the interstitial fluid. So it's important to think of them separately because they're going to have different kind of regulation. We're going to be thinking a lot about differences between them when we see them again. So when we get to the different body systems, we're going to be thinking about exchange between the external and internal systems. And then when we talk about the blood specifically, we'll be thinking about the difference between the interstitial fluid and the plasma. Right? So we're going to have movement of nutrients, oxygen between the external portion of the body plan, right? So like the lungs, the plasma, right? We'll have nutrients, oxygen moving from the lungs, nutrients moving from the gastrointestinal tract moving in. We'll have those things move between the plasma and the tissue fluid. And then ultimately they'll get from that interstitial fluid into our cells. Things that go out, wastes, toxins, unneeded materials, byproducts of metabolism, things like that. Eventually you breathe out CO2. We'll talk about that when we get to the lungs and the pulmonary system. So we're not going to go into too big depth on these terms down here until basically we think mostly about these when we get to the kidneys and also to the lungs. But basically we have absorption, secretion, filtration, and reabsorption. These are all terms for movement across these different barriers. right? So we can see absorption, right? If you absorb some nutrients from that big burrito you ate, right? They go through the lining of your gastrointestinal tract, they go into the body, and ultimately, right, you might get glucose, some sugar out of that tortilla, right? Go into your bloodstream and be delivered to the other cells in the body. Secretion would be the opposite direction. It's like the opposite here of absorption. So secretion, you might have a waste product that you want to get rid of from that bloodstream after you process the nutrients coming in. So secretion, you would move things out of the bloodstream, out to the external environment. Then we have filtration and reabsorption, which we talk a lot about when we get to the renal system, to the kidneys. So filtration, right? Filtering, what you're specifically filtering in filtration is the blood. Reabsorption is when we have stuff that we filtered out and then we reabsorb it back into the blood, back into the body. So those concepts really come up in our renal system. So expect to see absorption and secretion more often until we get to A&P 2. All right. Pause for questions. Okay. So we're going to expect to see exchange between all these different locations that we can see in this body plan, between the blood and the external environment. We'll have to cross those epithelial barriers, but we could move CO2 out of the bloodstream after we have metabolism going on, out into the lungs, out into the external environment. We'll also have things crossing the gastrointestinal tract, crossing the kidneys. Right? We can see those with these arrows, the secretion, absorption, reabsorption, and filtration. Specifically, we're going to see absorption and secretion more commonly across the gastrointestinal tract. And as I was saying in the previous slide with the definitions of these terms, filtration and reabsorption are mostly happening in the kidneys. Secretion is happening in both the gastrointestinal tract and the kidneys. But we'll focus on these more when we get to these systems specifically. So let's see if this works. I think it's active. So anybody who has a device, you can go to this website and respond. If you don't have a device, that's fine. Just think about this in your head and we'll go over the answers. I'll break it up. Should pull up a picture that you can click on. It's polev.com and then /KAYAZ. That's my name, 040. And usually there's also a number you can text. Oops. Oh, I see someone clicked, I think. Yeah, so these little dots are showing up where people are clicking on the image. Our gastrointestinal tract, our digestive tract, right, is right here, right? So this is part of our external environment, where we have things moving. You see, yeah, right here, this pipe in purple. So on this diagram, everything that's this kind of purple blue color is our external environment. Everything that's purple and only what is purple is external, I should say. All right, so let's find the lungs. Let's do some clicking. Great. Let's see some lungs up there at the top, right? So we can see gas exchange happening here. Lungs, another part of our external environment. That's why they're colored this bluish purple. Let's find a kidney. Yeah, we see the kidney here. So basically our kidneys are filtering the blood. They're basically producing urine, right? So the kidneys are going to be connected to your bladder. That bladder and the urethra that tract out of the bladder are part of your external environment as well. Cool. Oh, and last, look for the heart. Cool. Okay. So we have the heart here in this orangish beige color. I think we should notice here about the heart, right? It is a named organ that we've probably heard of before, but it's the only one basically on here that's labeled that we're considering part of the internal environment rather than the external environment. So blood moving through your heart, moving through blood vessels, that's part of your internal environment. Oops. I got to work on this. Apparently displaying the answer to you immediately. Okay, so we'll practice this more in the future. But what you want to be able to do once we get to the exam is we want to be able to tell the difference between the internal environment and the external environment. And specifically when you're thinking about the internal environment, it's going to be a little bit trickier than when you're thinking about the external environment. So as we look at the breakdown of total body water, which we're looking at next, we're going to see that the internal environment, we're going to be thinking about a bunch of kind of different categories. We're going to be thinking about one of them, extracellular fluid, but then we're going to be breaking that down into our interstitial fluid and our plasma as well. Okay, so basically, you think about the lungs, the gastrointestinal tract, the kidney, all the air outside of you, that's external. Everything else is internal. Our body fluids and compartments, dividing our body into compartments in order to think about where the water is. Your whole body has tons of fluid in it, right? We got fluid in the cells, we got fluid outside the cells. We think about these compartments, we think about them as being separated by epithelial membranes. So epithelium is always going to be a type of cell kind of lining different compartments, lining outside versus inside, but we'll see it a couple of other places in the body as well. Okay. Now, hopefully you remember this from your previous classes, but we will be going into it more in detail in the coming weeks as well. Want to remember that membranes are semi-permeable, all right, like the outside of a cell. Some stuff can cross it, some stuff can't. So that's going to be true for these compartments as well, because their linings are made of cells. So we're going to see that we are able to control what crosses from one compartment into another. Right, so the word for things crossing cell membranes and therefore also these cell layers is transport. Later in this unit, we'll be doing a review of different types of transport, right? Passive, active, and their different subtypes. So if you have your old notes on those, it might be worth digging them out. So total body water is all the water that is in our internal environment. We're going to be thinking a lot about movement between different segments, different compartments that basically break up our total body water. So the total body water is water. It also consists of dissolved materials inside of the water, right, that are mixed in, right, in that kind of solution. So things like ions, right? We'll also be thinking about glucose a lot. Your textbook likes to use diabetes as kind of a real world example of why we're thinking about all these different A&P concepts. So glucose is going to be an important thing that's going to be mixed in this water. Often, when we're thinking about your bloodstream. So we're thinking, when we think about total body water, all of the solutions in the body. Total body water, we're thinking about solutions both in the cells and surrounding the cells. So in that cytoplasm in a cell, but also in the interstitial fluid between tissues, also in the plasma surrounding our blood cells. This is just that picture again. Our body fluids are going to be subdivisions of the total body water. So we're now going to be subdividing the water that's in our internal environment. So TBW is an abbreviation for total body water. So we're going to name our compartments and the body fluids. They're going to have the same name, just to make life easier, right? So we're going to be thinking about an intracellular fluid. We're going to be thinking about an extracellular fluid first. So intracellular, right, tells us where it is inside, intra, the cells, right? So we can see that in blue here on the left. So here we have our little clumps of cells. These are tissues, right? So we can see they're colored blue. So the intracellular fluid is inside these sort of simplified cells over here. What else do we see colored blue here in the intracellular fluid? All right. I know you can see. Well, I know at least some of you can see blue.
Blood cells?
Yeah, exactly. You can see these blood cells here. All right, so inside are blood cells, but not the fluid in the plasma surrounding them. So the intracellular fluid has to be inside a cell, whether that's in the tissue or it's in a blood cell in the bloodstream. Everything else is extracellular fluid. So that includes this interstitial fluid just out here in the part, whatever, this part here. But it also includes that plasma surrounding the blood cells, right? So this stuff here. This would be our plasma. That is also considered extracellular fluid because it's not contained by a cell membrane, right? It's not full of organelles. So it's outside the cell, extra meaning outside, cellular meaning cell. So we have our ICF and our ECF. So if we were to break this down, right, our total body water, right, we make a little flow chart, total body water first. We have our ICF inside the cells, and then we have, if it's not ICF, it's ECF, ECF outside the cells. So our intracellular fluid is a compartment containing all the fluid inside our cells, how we name these body fluids. So basically cytoplasm is our ICF. ECF is everything outside the cells, but still within the body. So like if you're running from the parking lot through the rain, right, and your skin's getting wet, that's not extracellular fluid, right? Because that's part of the external environment. So even though it's sitting on top of your skin, we wouldn't really consider it part of the ECF because it's not part of your body. So when we're talking about intracellular fluid and extracellular fluid, right, we have our total body water, right? We want to specify that that total body water is only internal environment. So when we have the ECF, right, I'll draw the whole flow chart again. So our total body water is split into the ICF and the ECF. ICF and the ECF. And now that we're thinking about that ECF that is inside the body but outside the cells, we want to subdivide it and be very specific whether we're talking about interstitial fluid. Interstitial fluid. That. Or whether we're talking about plasma, right? Because our blood is going to be doing its own thing. It's going to be regulated separately. It's going to have its own special concentrations with different ions, all sorts of stuff. So these numbers in red text are basically extra. You won't be expected to memorize the 60, 40, 20, 80 numbers, but it's helpful to think about where most of the water is in a body. So if we think about it, we're thinking for a 70 kilogram person, right? Our total body water is going to be about 42 liters, right? 28 liters of that, so 40% of body weight is going to be ICF, so 40% of that water is inside cells. We have 20% of the body weight is outside the cells, right? So inside or outside, right? We have the 60% is the total body water, 40 and 20 adds to 60. And then we can split that 20% of body weight that is outside the cells, but inside the body, into plasma and interstitial fluid. So you see here, based on these numbers, more of this water is interstitial fluid than plasma, which kind of makes sense, right? You have a lot of blood, but you can kind of tell that most of your body is not made up solely of blood vessels. There's other stuff going on. So these checkpoint questions come from your textbook, but they are included in your lecture slides to basically remind you to do them. You can use these as kind of like essay prompts for studying. So these are the kinds of things you want to be thinking of, and I've folded ones that I think are particularly helpful for you to ruminate on after class. So thinking about extracellular fluid, you want to think about why that counts as part of the body's internal environment. Right? So for example, for this one, extracellular fluid, I'm just gonna do it out loud for you, but in the future, these are basically for your studying, right? You would say that the extracellular fluid, the body's internal environment, because all that extracellular fluid, it has to be inside the body or it doesn't count as part of total body water. All right, so rain, not part of the internal environment, therefore not part of the extracellular fluid. Sorry guys, I'll get these questions to link better. Always some tech issues. Last year we used the Zoom polling. Yeah, go ahead and pick it. So what's the term for fluid? It's located outside a cell, but it's in the blood specifically. This is basically the one that trips people up, right? So fluid outside the cells is technically extracellular fluid, but when we get to the exams, you'll see that we're going to have to be careful that we read questions very carefully. So you always got to read to the end of the question and kind of slow down when you're thinking. Right, so this first part, we look for fluid that's located outside of cells. Right, so we know we're thinking extracellular, but then we want to make sure that we also see the second part of the question. Right, so the second part of the question specifying we're talking about things in the blood. Right, so while the first part is referring to extracellular fluid, that second part in the blood lets us know that we're talking very specifically about the plasma. That's not displaying the answer. Okay, so let's try this one. So which fluid is outside cells, but outside the blood? Okay, so we got it split. Oh, percentage is changing. Okay, so we want to think about this question the same way we thought about that previous one. So we're thinking about fluid outside cells. So that part is extracellular fluid, but we're being specific now. So we have to remember we want outside a cell, but also not blood, outside the blood. So we're thinking here the interstitial fluid. So between our other cells, between our tissues, not in the blood. Our next topic that we're moving on to is homeostasis. And I suspect you have all heard this word before. So we're going to give our best shot at defining homeostasis before we talk about it. Great. Yeah. So this is kind of a reminder to not get scared when we talk about terms that you've heard before. We'll probably go into more detail in this class than you may have heard in high school, for example, if you've seen some of these terms. But don't let that frighten you. Homeostasis, right? We're talking about keeping a consistent environment, but specifically we're talking about keeping things in the body consistent, right? So in cells, in these compartments, right? We're thinking about the internal environment. While we like to use AC and heating, right? We don't consider maintaining the temperature in your house homeostasis, right? So it's not maintaining the external environment. We'll see with homeostasis that we actually have a range of values that are okay. Homeostasis means keeping things kind of similar, not keeping things exactly the same, right? So this relatively constant is an important part of the concept of homeostasis. We don't want a constant number, and we regulate things other than temperature. And we'll talk a lot about different things that we regulate, and not that one. And you can imagine if your internal environment always matched external conditions, right? When it's negative 23 outside, the inside of your body was also negative 23, that would be very bad. We don't want to do that. So we're not maintaining our internal and external conditions the same either. So we know what homeostasis is, but how do we do that? How do we keep the things that we're regulating regulated? We regulate some very important variables. We regulate temperature inside the body, right? Which, you know from everyday life, right? Like if you take your temperature, you think you're sick, you have a fever, right? You know that you have a fever because you know there's a number it should be at. There's a normal number for the temperature that your body should be. We also keep some less common to everyday life numbers the same. We think about blood pH. So how acidic or basic different parts of the body are, kept regulated. Blood volume, which is related to blood pressure, right? We also regulate. You can think high blood pressure, right? You've heard of that as being a problem, right? So when we get these things out of balance, it's a problem for the body. So we want to think about homeostasis, and we want to think about why it matters, right? Basically, the why it matters is that when we mess it up, we end up with these different disease states, right? Like a fever, like high blood pressure that ultimately causes health issues, right? We want to keep constant internal environment, and we want to keep it in the right range. So we're regulating things like temperature, volume. When we say volume, really mostly we mean volume of blood, not like the volume of your body. You can gain and lose weight. Right? Composition. When we talk about composition, we're really thinking about like composition of solutes and solutions. So we'll see as we get into, for example, we're going to be talking about the brain. We're going to be talking about neurons pretty soon. That's coming up in the next month or so. We're going to see that having the right balance of ions outside cells versus inside cells is really important to normal brain functions, being able to send signals down your nerves. So we want to be able to regulate these variables. So this is not going to be just one specific organ system's job, right? In the case of temperature, you kind of need to think how that would work, right? Like, not like your thumb or whatever is controlling the entire body's temperature. We're going to have our different organ systems working together to maintain homeostasis. If we don't do this, we have diseases, and if we really get out of control, right, there's a point at which your fever gets so high that it's dangerous, you could die, right? Really, really high fever is a really, really serious problem. So the way we keep these things in control is through feedback loops. And specifically, what we're going to see almost, but not always, we're going to be thinking about negative feedback loops. So we will be going over both negative and positive. But before we even look at the specifics, right, the word should kind of tell you what we're thinking about. Negative is kind of like subtracting. Negative is going to be moving us in the opposite direction of a change. Whereas when we see positive feedback loops, that's going to be like a snowball getting out of control, rolling down a hill. Positive feedback loop is going to be adding that same thing over and over and over again. Right? So if you see something running away out of control, that's going to be a positive feedback loop, which is sometimes important in some very specific isolated cases. Usually there's a negative feedback loop after the positive feedback loop. So when in doubt, thinking about feedback, you are probably thinking about negative feedback. That's what's going to bring us back down to a set point. Oh. We like graphs in this class, so we're going to draw a little graph. So when we think about negative feedback, right, we can think about something changing over time. So here, our x-axis is going to be time. Your book uses the example of a car as a sort of real life example of negative feedback in, you know, your everyday life. So if you think about like cruise control, that's a form of negative feedback, right? So the basic way negative feedback works is you have a set point, right? Set point for your regulated variable. Okay, so if we're thinking about a car, a regulated variable would be speed. Actually, that should probably be the title. Regulated variable. So say we're trying to keep our car at 60, right? So our speed limit is 60. We set our cruise control to 60. We want to just zone out, listen to our podcast, right? But then we encounter a hill, right? So what happens, your speed over time, right? We're at 60, right? You start to go up a hill, gravity pulls you back down, right? So you start to feel yourself getting a little slower as you go up that hill, right? This is the force of gravity pulling you down. Since you have your cruise control on though, your gas kicks in, right? Or if you're driving yourself, right? You don't have your cruise control on, you physically step on the gas to get up that hill, to get back up to the speed, right? So that's going to bring us back up to that set point, right? Sometimes when we're talking about body systems, we'll see kind of this oscillation, right? We might go down, we might overshoot, right? We put too much gas, so we then might go back down again. This is basically what homeostasis is doing as well. We're just trying to keep us somewhere around that set point. And we have a typical range where, you know, if we're going 55, that's not a huge problem. If we're going 65, not the end of the world either. Okay. So we're going to be thinking about these deviations, right? These are known as our error signal. All right, so error signal is here, is just the difference between your set point and where your body actually is, right? That's your error signal. So this is a figure in your textbook. Pay attention to figures when you look at your textbooks. That can be really helpful. And I know the textbook can be overwhelming at times, and looking at the figures can kind of help you immediately key in on what you don't understand and what you need to either read in more detail about or come ask me. Okay. So this shows us our car going up the hill. All right, we slow down a little bit as we start to go up the hill, and we can see that's producing our error signal. Right, then we start to speed up as we hit the gas until we're back at our set point, right? So our error signal is getting smaller and smaller and smaller until we're back to our set point. So this is the same for homeostasis. So regulated variables would be things like temperature, pH, right, volume of the blood, those different terms we had on our previous slides, right? Those are our regulated variables. Glucose levels are regulated. We'll talk about different regulated variables as we go through different body systems, right? They have their own set points, their own expected values. So your core body temperature in Celsius, because in science we think about Celsius, is 37 degrees Celsius. Your blood glucose level should be about 100 milligrams per deciliter. Your blood pH should be about 7.4. So if we drop above or below these set points, we're going to see a negative feedback loop kick in and bring us back. And I should say it counts as negative whether you go below or above. It counts as negative feedback, right? So if you drop down to 36 and then have to ramp back up to 37, that's a negative feedback loop. But if you go from 37 to 40 and have to pull yourself back to the set point, that is still a negative feedback loop. So don't get too tripped up by whether the line on the graph is going up or down. The negative part is just telling us that we're moving in the opposite direction of the change, not whether numerically that change was up or down. Does that make sense? That's another thing people can get a little confused on. You see this figure, you know, sometimes you see it's going up, so you think positive feedback loop, but a positive feedback loop would really look something like this, right? So it would be almost maybe asymptotic, right? It would be going up and up and up and up forever. If you see it coming back down to a set point, negative feedback. So when a regulated variable decreases or increases, we're going to see a change in the opposite direction, just self-correcting, going back to our set point. We have an error signal telling us how big of a change we saw. So the way that this is going to happen is by integrating different body systems, right? So we have a typical kind of system of how we actually figure out that we have an error signal, how we figure out that there's a deviation from that set point, and then how we fix it. So we can generalize this. Then when we talk about specific body systems and we talk about specific forms of negative feedback, we'll be tracking things like hormone levels, specific brain regions, specific sensors. But right now we're just thinking kind of general. So here on our graph, we see a change in blood pressure, which is a regulated variable. So blood pressure changes, kind of a problem for your body. It's something we want to keep at a set point because blood pressure is actually going to influence how different ions, different solutes move across your blood, and specifically also how water moves across our different epithelial membranes. So if you lie down and then suddenly stand up, I don't know if you've ever felt like a head rush. Sometimes my vision goes black and I see stars. I think that's not healthy, but I think it's probably happened to you as well. All right. So the reason you see stars is because your blood pressure suddenly falls. Right. So that sudden drop in blood pressure actually happening because all your blood is getting like pulled by gravity down and your heart hasn't caught up yet. So we'd consider that fall in blood pressure to be our stimulus. So that's like step one of our negative feedback loop. The stimulus is basically what's causing our error signal. There's a sensor next. So it's sensor. I tell you, make sure to look at the keys on the figures as well. The sensor in yellow is telling us that we can notice this. There are specific receptors, right? Receptors are sensors, sensing. That signal would then travel up your nerves to an integrating center. So this is where your brain gets involved, and it's going to then in turn relay these signals out to the appropriate organ systems. So in this case, the appropriate way to fix your blood pressure is to go to your heart. So when we talk about organ systems that are doing this negative feedback loop, we're going to call them effectors. Okay. And then it's going to drop that blood pressure, or in this case, raise that blood pressure back up to its set point. So we're going to be back to the set point, and that's the whole negative feedback loop. We're going to end there. I'm still here for questions. So.